Well, greetings and welcome to week number 14. This is our last full week together, and I will post the final exam to Blackboard with a brief mini lecture to wrap things up on next Sunday. So this week we're moving into the 1980s, and I'll begin by looking at the so-called culture wars of the 80s. Now, popular culture of the 1980s offered another venue in which conservatives and liberals waged a battle of ideas. So the militarism and patriotism of Reagan's presidency pervaded movies like Top Gun and the Rambo series, starring Sylvester Stallone as a Vietnam War veteran haunted by his country's failure to pursue victory in Southeast Asia. In contrast, director Oliver Stone offered searing condemnations of the war in Platoon and Born on the 4th of July, and maybe you've had a chance to see all of these films. If you don't, maybe some weekend viewing, you could check these out. Television shows like Dynasty and Dallas celebrated war and glamour, reflecting the pride and conspicuous consumption that emanated from the White House and corporate boardrooms during this decade. At the same time, films like Wall Street and novels like Bret Easton Ellis's Less Than Zero skewered the excesses of the rich. And it was at this time that the religious right increasingly perceived popular culture as hostile to Christian values. As you read in the previous weeks, the early 1960s Supreme Court decisions prohibiting teacher-led prayer and Bible readings in the public schools led many to conclude that a liberal judicial system threatened Christian values. In the following years, the counterculture celebration of sex and drugs and rock and roll, along with the relaxed obscenity and pornography laws, intensified the conviction that so-called permissive liberalism encouraged immorality in private life. And evangelical Protestants composed the core of the religious right, and these Christian conservatives had felt themselves under siege from liberalism. So the theme of this week's material is the relationship between the religious and political spheres here in the United States. Now, the Reagan Revolution marked the culmination of a long process of political mobilization of the American right. In the first 2 decades after World War II, the New Deal seemed firmly embedded in American electoral politics and public policy. Even a two-term Republican president like Dwight D. Eisenhower declined to roll back the welfare state. Following Lyndon Johnson's defeat of Republican Barry Goldwater, Mr. Conservative himself, in the 1964 presidential election, many observers declared American conservatism finished. New York Times columnist James Reston wrote that Goldwater had, quote, wrecked his party for a long time to come, unquote. But despite these dire predictions, conservatism not only persisted, it prospered. Its growing appeal had several causes. The expansive social and economic agenda of Johnson's Great Society reminded anti-communists of Soviet-style central planning, and deficits alarmed fiscal conservatives. So with the increasing assertiveness of the 1960s and 1970s culture, Christian conservatives mobilized to protect what they saw as the traditional family. Women composed a striking number of the religious right support system. In 1968 and 1969, a group of newly politicized mothers in Anaheim, California, led a sustained protest against sex education in public schools. And Catholic activist Phyllis Schlafly marshaled opposition to the Equal Rights Amendment, while evangelical pop singer Anita Bryant drew national headlines for her successful fight to repeal Miami's gay rights ordinance in 1977. In 1979, Beverly LaHaye, whose husband Tim, an evangelical pastor in San Diego, who later co-authored the wildly popular Left Behind Christian book series, she founded Concerned Women for America, which linked small groups of local activists opposed to the ERA, abortion, homosexuality, and no-fault divorce. So activists like Schlafly and LaHaye, they valorized motherhood as a woman's highest calling. And more than perhaps any other issue, abortion drew different segments of the religious right, Catholics and Protestant, women and men together. The Supreme Court's 1973 Roe v. Wade ruling outraged many devout Catholics and evangelicals. And the evangelicals had been less universally opposed to the procedure than their Catholic counterparts. You'll read about this in a journal article that I've included in your primary source material so that you can read about this yourself. Christian author Francis Schaeffer cultivated evangelical opposition to abortion through the 1979 documentary Whatever Happened to the Human Race. And she argued that, quote, the fate of the unborn is the fate of the human race, unquote. So, with abortion framed in very stark as existential terms, many evangelicals felt compelled to combat the procedure through political action. Grassroots passion drove anti-abortion activism, but a set of religious and secular institutions turned the various strands of the new right into a sophisticated movement. In 1979, Jerry Falwell, a Baptist minister and religious broadcaster from Lynchburg, Virginia, founded the Moral Majority. And this was a political organization dedicated to advancing a, quote, pro-life, pro-family, pro-morality, and pro-American, unquote, agenda. The Moral Majority skillfully wove together social and economic appeals to make itself a force in Republican politics. In 1960, Pat Robertson had founded the Christian Broadcast Network out of Portsmouth, Virginia. Robertson had recently become a born-again Christian, and he began broadcasting religious content funded by small donations from individuals and local churches. The Christian Broadcasting Network has been, since the 1960s, has been at the forefront of the culture wars since its early inception. Unlike the Republican Party, the Democratic Party stood in an ideological crossroads in 1984, and the favorite to win the party's nomination was Walter Mondale, a staunch ally of organized labor and the civil rights movement. He served as Jimmy Carter's vice president. Mondale's chief rivals were civil rights activist Reverend Jesse Jackson and Colorado Senator Gary Hart. And Hart was one of the young Democrats elected to Congress in 1974 following Nixon's downfall. At the national level, civil rights leader and Baptist minister Jesse Jackson became the first African American man to run for president when he campaigned for the party's nomination, both in 1984 and 1988. So, propelled by the chants of "Run, Jesse, Run," Jackson achieved notable success in the 1988 campaign, winning 9 state primaries and finishing second with 29% of the vote. His work as a civil rights activist garnered him a significant following in the African American community, but not enough to secure the Democratic nomination. So you'll listen to these 3 men, Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, and Jesse Jackson. I've provided YouTube video links for you to listen to. And so keep in mind that at this time, during the early 90s, America had moved into a post-Cold War era and things were changing. Americans looked anxiously to the future as to what this new era would bring. And so would it bring, as Samuel Huntington argued, a clash of civilizations, the East versus the West, the Christian world versus the Muslim world? In Sam Huntington's article titled The Clash of Civilizations, this appeared in the summer of 1993 in an issue of Foreign Affairs. The article itself attracted a surprising amount of attention and reaction. And it was intended to give Americans kind of a view of what we could expect after with this kind of post-Cold War era that we were living in. His thesis was about a new phase in world politics. His argument, to many seemed compelling, even visionary. The basic paradigm of the East versus the rest. Was this a Cold War framework kind of reformulated? Did the terrible events of September 11th become proof of Huntington's thesis? Or was this thesis, this culture clash between the East and the West too simplistic. And Edward Said would argue it really failed to make sense of a disorderly reality that can't be pigeonholed or labeled so easily. Generalizations and broad sweeping cultural assertions were inadequate to understanding the reality of the world. And so I've included sermons that deal with international events and situated in this context so that you can really think about America's relationship in a more globalized world. So you'll listen to some sermons talking about America's relationship with Israel, with the Middle East. You'll read Obama's speech in Cairo. What did that signify? Was it in part a sermon to the Muslim world? So think about how globalization impacts the shape of our religion here at home. Your textbook sums up religion in America as pluralistic, quoting one woman as saying, quote, "One day I woke up and wondered, maybe today I should be a Christian, or would I rather be a Buddhist, or am I just a Star Trek freak?" Unquote. So what does America's vast religious marketplace offer? There's therapies, advice books, spiritual techniques, retreats, diets. Do those shape religious identities? Is there a religious consensus in America? A single identity? Not a single self, but a community of selves. Is this cause for alarm or celebration? This plurality? Are New Age journeys part of an old age quest that we all find ourselves on? What will the story of religion in the late 21st century be? Is it one of fragment or one of unity? So think about the dangers inherent in each. And as your book asks, what are the perennials of the American religious garden? And in this garden, there are also those who are non-religious. So I've added a few links for you to think about that. Take a look at the non-religious segment of Americans and perhaps how they fit into this garden. So as I said, this is the last of our regular classes. I will have a short mini lecture. You have your final précis due, or it was due, and I hope you've got that in. I'll post a prompt for the final on next Sunday. So in the meantime, if you have any questions, if you're trying to play catch up with some of the assignments, please contact me and I'll be happy to help you. Thank you and have a good week.